to be deployed in the US. President Trump moves to stop the rioting following the death of George Floyd.
If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
Here, amid anger over the government's plan for a 14-day quarantine for arrivals to the UK, a hint that some of the rules could be relaxed by the end of July.
And the row over the future of thousands of British Airways staff intensifies. Crew members tell the BBC they're being sacrificed, while the airline says its proposals will protect more jobs.
And they're off. No crowds on the course, but the first post-lockdown winners came on the track at Newcastle as jockeys adapt to racing's return.
Good morning. A bit of a change in the weather today in the north. We've got some thicker cloud, rain or showers across northern Scotland, eventually slipping into Northern Ireland and Northern England. But for the rest of England and Wales, another dry, sunny and very warm day.
A tribute to the more than 39,000 people who've died from coronavirus. 3 months on from the first death in the UK, we have a specially commissioned poem in their memory.
So if you lost someone you loved, you take the sound of their laugh and keep it in the depth of your heart.
That's all coming up later. It's Tuesday, the 2nd of June. Very good morning to you. Our main story. President Trump has announced he's taking immediate action to stop the rioting and looting that has swept the US. It was triggered by the death of African-American man George Floyd while in police custody in Minneapolis last week.
In a televised address at the White House overnight, Mr. Trump said he was deploying thousands of heavily armed soldiers and police in Washington and that an overnight curfew would be strictly enforced. He also threatened to send in the military if governors failed to take action to quell the violence. Here's our correspondent in Los Angeles, Sophie Long.
More than a week after George Floyd became the latest African-American to needlessly lose his life at the hands of a white police officer, the pain is still palpable. Nowhere more so than here, the street in Minneapolis where he died. His brother came to the makeshift memorial and made a plea for peace.
If I'm not over here messing up my community, come on. Then what are y'all doing? What are y'all doing? Y'all doing nothing. Because that's not going to bring my brother back at all.
A second post-mortem examination found George Floyd died from asphyxiation, and it was homicide. Delivering the findings, his family's lawyer urged people to stand with them peacefully. Meanwhile, crowds gathered for a 7th night of protests. Thousands spilled onto the streets in cities from the west coast to the east, demanding an end to racial injustice. In the capital, protesters were forced away from the White House by police, firing canisters of tear gas, so the president could tell state governors, if you don't stop this, I will.
Mayors and governors must establish an overwhelming law enforcement presence until the violence has been quelled. If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace.
To do so would involve wielding extraordinary federal authority.
President Trump declared himself an ally of legitimate protesters like these here in Los Angeles. But some fear his threat to use an antiquated act to deploy military personnel across America's cities could spark more anger and potentially further escalate an already increasingly tense situation.
On the streets of Los Angeles, the looting started before sunset, and America braced itself for another difficult and dangerous night. Sophie Long, BBC News, Los Angeles.
Well, let's find out how that night is going, shall we? We can speak now to our North America correspondent, Peter Bowes, who's also in Los Angeles for us. Peter, not just in LA, but across the states tonight. How's it looking?
It's looking a lot better, John, than it has for the last few days. There's still been trouble in some places. We've just been hearing in Los Angeles. I was struck here in this city by the number of people that were just being lined up against walls in the streets, handcuffed as soon as the curfew came into effect, the dusk to dawn curfew that we've had here for now 2 days in a row. We've heard similar stories from New York City, where there's been some looting, also some trouble in Washington, but not, thankfully, on the scale that we saw, John, over the weekend.
So the president's words at the White House last night, has that helped to quell things, or is there a risk that that could inflame things yet further?
Well, there's certainly been a lot of concern that over the next few days it could be a risky strategy. It's certainly on the basis of the last few hours doesn't seem to have encouraged more people to go out onto the streets. But what the president didn't address during his speech from the White House in the Rose Garden was the issue, the very issue about racial that is concerning so many people. It was purely about law and order, indeed describing himself as the law and order president and laying down that challenge to state governors to essentially to clear the streets and sort out the situation. Otherwise, he will send in the military.
OK, Peter, we'll check in and get a bit later. For now, thank you very much indeed. Peter Bowes there.
Measures to relax a 14-day quarantine for arrivals to the UK are being considered by government ministers.
Yeah, the proposed move comes amid signs of a rebellion among MPs who are concerned about the impact of quarantine on the aviation and tourism industry. Andy Moore explains.
The beaches of Spain, like here at Malaga, are beginning to open up. But will we be able to get to them? Spain's tourism minister says the UK's coronavirus figures will have to improve before British tourists can be welcomed back. And as well as problems at our intended destination, we'll also have to deal with 2 weeks isolation when we return. That scheme has alarmed many in the tourism industry and on the backbenches of the Conservative Party. We'll get more detail today, but the plan, which starts next week, will be reviewed every 3 weeks. One possibility to ease the quarantine is to create so-called air bridges or travel corridors to places with similar levels of infection. That might not come in the first review, but could come towards the end of July, just at the start of the school holiday in England. The UK's Test, Track and Trace programme is one of the keys to reducing levels of infection. It was launched last Thursday, but we haven't heard much about it, apart from reports of some staff having little to do. But Mr Hancock told the Downing Street press conference the vast majority of newly infected people and their contacts had been traced.
We've hired, as you know, 25,000 people to work as contact tracers, and the level of incidence of disease has come down. And so actually, we have more capacity than we need. This is a good thing.
There were 111 deaths reported yesterday in all settings, and an additional 445 deaths previously not reported where coronavirus tests were carried out in private labs. But the death rate is generally trending downwards, and Britain is beginning to open up again for business. A clear sign of that could be seen outside the 19 IKEA stores that opened up for trade yesterday. At some places, up to 1,000 people were said to be queuing patiently in socially distanced lines. Andy Moore, BBC News.
What a very British thing. We'll be talking about queues later, actually. Also, let's hear more from our political correspondent, Helen Catt, and specifically, let's talk about quarantine. Is the government moving on the quarantine issue?
Well, Conservative MPs have been told that the government is looking at ways of changing the quarantine rules. And certainly Downing Street has previously said that the government is looking at this idea of air bridges or travel corridors, although it's not at this moment in time policy. This, as you heard there in Andy's report, this policy does get reviewed every 3 weeks after it comes in next Monday. So I think there is going to be pressure at each of those 3-week reviews to make some sort of changes. And certainly more MPs seem to be concerned about this. The worries are, of course, that the aviation industry has had such a tough time already this year that this would make it even harder for it to recover. And then there have been, for example, last week, a group of MPs from lots of different parties parties formed a pressure group essentially to try and back the aviation industry. That's headed up by the Conservative MP who has Gatwick Airport in his constituency, which is obviously a massive employer. So there's certainly backbench pressure building to try and get the government to change course.
Also, we know that MPs are supposed to be returning to Parliament today, and not all of them entirely happy about that.
No, well, over the last few weeks, Parliament has been working under this specific set of rules, this special set of rules, which have allowed voting and contributions to debates to be done remotely via video conference or online in the case of voting. But the government has said it doesn't want to renew those rules. Those rules have lapsed because it says that MPs need to come back to Westminster to set an example. Now, that has caused problems for some in terms of, what happens to MPs who are shielding, who can't come back, what happens to MPs who have to come from very long distances. And there are also some technical problems too. The only recognised way of voting in the Commons is to physically count MPs, and they usually go through 2 specific rooms to do that. The aye lobby if you want to vote yes, or the no lobby if you want to vote no. Public Health England has said you can't keep social distancing in those. So the Parliament has got to come up with a whole new way of the Commons to even vote, which at the moment looks like it's going to be a very long queue snaking around Parliament.
Thank you very much. We'll be speaking to a couple of MPs on both sides of that particular issue a little bit later. Thank you.
20 police forces across England, Scotland and Wales caught motorists driving at more than 100 miles an hour during the early stages of lockdown. That's according to data from the police that's been obtained by the RAC today. The highest speed clocked was 151 miles an hour on the M62 motorway in West Yorkshire. The RAC have described the speeds as truly shocking and have warned that motorists travelling that fast have virtually no time to react if anything unexpected should happen.
British soldiers accused of committing war crimes in Iraq are unlikely to face criminal prosecution. The director of the Service Prosecution Authority, Andrew Cayley, says he's now considering only one remaining case after thousands of allegations of abuse by British forces were dismissed. He also said he believed the International Criminal Court would soon close its own investigations.
Now, we've seen birthday parties in lockdown, we've seen weddings in lockdown. What about an incredible milestone of an 80th wedding anniversary in lockdown? Here they are, bless them. Eric and Nancy Kingston from Somerset, been married since June 1940. It's thought they're one of the world's longest married couples. They had some long-distance visitors yesterday, dropping off some flowers. Lockdown restrictions mean they couldn't celebrate with the whole family, which includes 14 great-great-grandchildren. Goodness knows how many great and normal grandchildren. But the couple got together in 1938 with a bit of help from Nancy's brother.
That was it. It went from there, didn't it? Yeah. And we still love one another.
What's the secret of being together as Britain's longest married couple?
Well, love a lot. Yeah, still holding hands. I had a kiss this morning in bed before I had my breakfast.
So you're still, sir, very much in love with this lady?
Yes.
Oh, kiss before breakfast.
Isn't that so sweet? I'm sure have a look at the papers this morning at 30 minutes past 6. The Daily Telegraph's front page focuses on the government's plan to introduce a 2-week quarantine for everyone arriving in the UK. It says the scheme, which will be brought before Parliament today, has caused a revolt among Conservative MPs.
The Daily Mail leads with a study funded by the World Health Organization that suggests keeping just 1 metre apart from others rather than 2 metres, as we do here in the UK, could be enough to reduce the risk of catching coronavirus. The paper suggests that the findings could fuel calls from businesses like pubs and restaurants to relax that 2 metre rule, thinking that might help the economy. It's not that straightforward, though, is it?
Hold the front page, because The Guardian also looks at that World Health Organization research, but the paper warns that reducing the distance we keep apart from each other to only 1 metre could double the infection risk.
More science to come, I think. New York Times, here we go, front pages of the big American papers, dominated, of course, by the protests spreading across the US. The New York Times there reading that as chaos spreads, Trump vows to end it now, referencing President Trump's speech, which we heard earlier, where he said he would send in the army to end those protests if state governments can't get them under control themselves.
We'll be talking about all of that throughout the programme, actually. Also, should we have a look at the inside pages too?
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah.
So many of us I imagine, are hoping that we might be able to go on some sort of summer holiday. And there's a real sense, isn't there, John, today, of confusion, actually. But this is from the Daily Mail. So at the moment, and I would stress sort of at the moment, because everything changes quite quickly, which travel spots can you fly to? So, for example, Italy, you can go from June the 3rd with no quarantine on arrival, but of course MPs talking about quarantine when you come back here today. Greece, you might be allowed to travel from June the 15th with tests for coronavirus and quarantines. Germany, Britons can go from June the 15th with no quarantine. Travels advised to only make essential trips. And France, for example, only those travelling for work or family reasons at the moment are allowed to enter. No mandatory quarantine, but France has threatened this for Britons if we don't grant the French an exemption 2 hours. So, I mean, I'm not going to give any travel advice because I'm not a travel operator.
And it changes. I mean, every day it seems to change, doesn't it?
Check is the only thing you can do, I think. And we're talking to a government minister particularly. We'll talk about quarantine later today as well.
Once flight starts, you can imagine what airports are going to be like with the check-in and dividing people up and baggage and reclaim, that kind of thing. This might give us a clue about what we face at airports.
Yes,
this was a well-known Swedish furniture store which opened some of its branches yesterday. This is the Warrington branch. You see the yellow line there, which seems to match their logo rather helpfully, doesn't it? The queue starts out here and goes all the way for a mile. Would you need a sofa that much? Or a tea light? You go all the way. All I wanted was a pot plant. You get to the front. God,
apparently, I think people
hours.
started at queuing at 5. I think it opened at 9 or something, and they started queuing at 5:40 in the morning.
Yeah.
We're talking about queues a little bit later. Because queues are going to have to change, aren't they? I mean, we're pretty good at queuing.
We do queuing. We
do queuing, but can we do
queuing.
Queuing at 2 metres? We can in the supermarket. People where I go seem to be good at that. Anyway, lots of questions. We know that some sport is back. I mean, we were talking about racing pigeons yesterday, weren't we? And here is the moment. Freedom. More than 4,000 pigeons taking off in the first race since lockdown. Racing pigeons taking flight. Snooker, of course, queued off, and the Queen settled in, apparently. Well, I'm not sure whether they know that, but true, for sure. For a day at the races, not, of course, going there, because we know the racing taking place behind closed doors yesterday. Sally's got more on the sport later.